Hi everyone, my name is Jack Haggquist, and I am here to give you a presentation on Sakurajima volcano. Without further ado, let's get right into it. So, just to introduce this volcano, it is in Japan, and it is the most active volcano in Japan at the moment. It is located at the southern tip, right down here, and it is within the Kagoshima Bay, as you can see right here. So, in order to understand the entire volcanic activity of Sakurajima, we have to first start at the origin, that being the area caldera. The area caldera is this large red circle right here. And as you can see, Sakurajima sits on the southern tip of it. And area caldera has erupted 6 times within the last 100,000 years, 4 being Palladian style, and 2 being pyroclastic flow. The last major eruption was 29,000 years ago and deposited 500 kilometers cubed of tephra, which is quite a substantial amount. The area caldera also has a smaller caldera within it, the Wakamiko caldera, which is this small red circle right here. The Wakamiko is still active today and 200 meters below the surface and produces fumarolic activity. Now, this is an important place to start, and remember these two calderas. They will be important to understanding the magmatic system of Sakurajima. So, volcanic activity. Sakurajima formed 26,000 years ago, about 3,000 years after the last area caldera eruption. Sakurajima is essentially two overlapping stratovolcanic Sakurajima is essentially two overlapping stratovolcanic cones, the Kitadake and the Minamidake. The Minamidake also has a small lateral event called Nanadake, and you can see that right here, this small little guy. And Minamidake is also the younger of these two cones. Kitadake is largely dominated by interbedded lavas and pyroclastic rocks, while Minamidake is primarily dominated by its lava. Now, we can classify Sakurajima's volcanic activity by 4 different stages: the older Kitadake, the younger Kitadake, the older Minamidake, and the younger Minamidake. Whew. Again, going over this extensive volcanic history will really help to understand the current state of volcanic activity, which is very complicated. Okay, so now moving into the first stage of the volcanic activity, we have the older Kitadake. This happened during 26,000 to 24,000 years ago. And during this period, Sakurajima deposited just a few tephra layers. And this is definitely probably the least important of the 4 stages. And after the older Kitadake, there was this 10,000 year dormant period where there really wasn't any activity. However, when looking at some of the ejecta data around the surrounding area, they found 2 different layers were expelled during this period. The composition of these layers were similar to the Arya caldera. Remember that guy? And so it is assumed that the Wakamiko caldera produced these. However, they were expelled, and now the data is, of course, slightly uncertain. And of course, during this period, the eruptions were all Palladian. Moving on to the younger Kitadake, this began 13,000 years ago. And during this period, the largest eruption of Sakurajima occurred, depositing 11 kilometers cubed of pyroclastic material. To put into perspective how large this was, the second largest eruption of Sakurajima doesn't exceed 2 kilometers cubed. So this is what, a magnitude up in pyroclastic material. So this one was huge. So during this time, most of the lavas and the layers were all deposited around the same time. And of course, this is a Palladian style eruption that are mostly dacitic. And following that, moving on to the Minamidake. The older Minamidake started about 4,500 years ago, and these eruptions were deposited volcanic sands for nearly 3,000 years continually, and was the only Vulcanian-style eruptions for Sakurajima until the close present, which we will talk about a little later. During this period, the main body of Sakurajima was essentially formed. So, the younger Minamidake. This is the big guy. The younger Minamidake started in 764 AD and reverted back to Palladian-style eruptions instead of the Vulcanian-style eruptions. During this period, there was minimal eruptions with very few layers, and most of these eruptions were historical eruptions, which we will cover next slide. It should still be stated that technically we are still in the Minamidake period today. And a lot of volcanic activity in the mid 1950s is still considered younger Minamidake, and we'll explain in a couple slides here why the 1950s are so important. So let's look at some of these historical eruptions. In the younger Minamidake, there were 4 historical or major eruptions. The first being the Tempo Hyoji, which, as you can see, starts in 764 AD, which is to start the younger Minamidake. Whew. After this eruption, there is no record between this first major event and the second major event. So there was no eruptions during these 2 time periods. However, when looking at some of the ejecta and the data that surrounds it, they found there was another eruption in between here. And it is said that, again, the Wakamiko caldera produced these, or some volcanic eruption nearby, but there's no definitive record of any eruption between this. And of course, you can see andesitic to dacitic. One note you should start looking at is a lot of the eruptions in the past were dacitic, and they will slowly start to move to more andesitic, which might be an important point when understanding the volcanic history. All right, next up, the Bunmai eruption, and this was the largest Palladian-style eruption in historical times for Minamidake. It continued to erupt for nearly 6 years, so there was documentation essentially stating there was massive damage dealt by this eruption, but the extent of the damage is unknown from this huge eruption if it happens over 6 years. And you can see it is felsic-dacitic as well, which is quite an intriguing pattern, I guess I could say. All right, next up, then in the 1779, the On-I eruption occurred. And this eruption was preceded by earthquakes, discoloration of the seawater, well water was boiling, and well water was increasing as well. And again, this was a Palladian-style eruption that also changed some of the topography in the area. And so during this eruption, the earthquakes caused by this eruption caused another submarine eruption to occur. Not the Wakamiko, but just some other submarine eruption, and it uplifted a small number of islands. And when these islands were uplifted, this caused massive tsunamis that were said to be about 20 meters high and killed quite a few people. And it should be noted that after this eruption, the SiO2 content of the eruptions went down. And so we'll see here in the next slide, SiO2 content was very consistent through all these periods. And after the On-A, the SiO2 content started to go down. All right. And the last, number 4, on the historical eruptions in the younger Minamidake was the Taisho eruption of 1914. This again was a Palladian-style eruption that had multiple long eruptions over this period of time. The first major eruption lasted an entire day and then started to weaken over the next two weeks. But during this first eruption, it caused a massive 7.1 earthquake, which led to injury and the death of 35 people. One of the coolest points of this eruption, not that it was cool, but that it filled this a strait called the Seto Strait, which is on the east side of the island. And we can go back real quick right here. So this strait right here, Sakurajima used to be an island, and after the Taisho eruption, when some of the lava flowed down here, it filled in the Seto Strait and connected it to this peninsula. And so technically, Sakurajima is no longer an island, which is pretty cool. And then, of course, another really interesting thing, after the whole eruption, the land around the Arya caldera and Kagoshima City, we can go back here to see Kagoshima City, right here, they sunk, their entire city sunk 30 to 50 centimeters, which is pretty wild to me. And the Taisho eruption was andesitic, and so you can see that, goes from andesitic to dacitic. Felsic dacitic was slightly weird, but it goes from dacitic to more andesitic from these major eruptions and throughout the history of the entirety of Sakurajima. And so this picture right here is the actual eruption. Picture taken in 1914 or something, which I think was pretty cool. You see them on a little wooden boat running for their lives. Pretty crazy. All right, so after the Taisho, what happened? This is where things start to get a little more interesting. In 1939, there was a pyroclastic flow from the. Let me start over on that guy, okay? To highlight, we are still in the younger Minamidake stage, so don't forget that. However, what happens after Taisho, the volcanic activity starts to change drastically. And the first eruption after the 1915 Taisho eruption was when the Showa crater can be seen right here, right next to the Nanadake lateral vent of the Minamidake. This Showa event erupted and had some pyroclastic flow from Showa crater. Then it erupted again, but about 7-8 years later. But this time, instead of being a Plinian eruption or a pyroclastic flow, it was a Vulcanian style eruption. So this top picture is showing Showa crater's first eruption, and then of course I pointed out the Showa down here. So then the big year hit, 1955. In 1955, the Minamidake summit, so the summit being probably somewhere about in here, had a huge spike in activity of Vulcanian style eruptions. And these eruptions would happen daily, indicate like every single day this volcano would start erupting, till from 1955 to today. These eruptions weren't massive like the Taisho, but they continued every day, which is pretty insane. I mean, a volcano for 50 years just constantly pushing out ash. It's wild. So for example, in 1984, there were a total of 474 explosive eruptions that year. And then it started to decrease coming into the year 2000, but then it started back up in 2007 near the Showa crater. So the Showa crater started now pumping out these Vulcanian-style eruptions. And in 2010, there were a total, I believe, of 896 explosive eruptions and 996 in 2011. Nearly 1,000 eruptions in a single year. That is insane. And it should be noted that these eruptions in the early 2010s were not nearly as big as the ones in the 1980s. But again, the ones in the 1980s were not as big as the Taisho and those other large ones that changed topography, the An-ai, the Bunmi. So now that we kind of know its history of the many, many different activity they've had, let's look at the volcanic rocks. The volcanic rocks at Sakurajima are medium K-series andesite dicites. Andesite to dicites. These magmas are of intermediate composition. However, as time goes on, as time is increased, of course, the magmas are getting more mafic from the mantle. And this gets a little greasy in here, but the magma system changed at the younger Minamidake when the trace mineral content changed drastically. It was enriched in all of these guys and poor in magnesium and calcium. And another very important note, which really helped determine the change in the magma system, was this inclusion of zirconium, I believe this is zirconium, and thorium trace elements. And see, I told you this guy would be important again. The Aria caldera showed low zirconium and thorium, but showed high 87 strontium, 86 strontium isotopes. And as we kept looking at the ejecta data, we noticed that the strontium, the 87 strontium, the 86 strontium decreased as time moved on, and the zirconium thorium trace element increased. And so this pushed the idea that the magma system changed, essentially. Definitely got a little more complicated in there. And a couple, Kobayashi from 2014, he goes into real high depth on that, but it was a little past my pay grade. But they did confirm that the magma system did change in the younger Minamidake. All right, now that we've gone over that huge background of that, we'll just tell you about the citizens. And so I hope you guys can see already some of the issues that this volcano produces. The potential hazards are very dangerous for this volcano. As stated earlier, there were multiple different eruptions that caused multiple different fatalities, from tsunamis, earthquakes, the volcanoes themselves. There's been a lot of death around this volcano. But one of the biggest concerns for today are these 1955 Vulcanian-style eruptions. And if you remember, of course, these eruptions were not nearly as big as those major eruptions like Taisho back in 1914. These 1955 ones and future are small. However, they're very deadly and can be very deadly. They contain a mineral called cristobalite, which forms before eruption and during the vapor phase deposition of volcanic glass when they essentially form as nanofibers in the ash. And they can be very dangerous to inhale as they show very similar properties to asbestos. Asbestos, if you don't know, being a fiber-like rock, which if you breathe it in, it could cause fibrosis and respiratory diseases such as that. And so this cristobalite is very dangerous to this area, and a lot of studies are currently being done on how they can deal with this and what the threat is to them. And it should be stated that the grain size of these crystobalites do matter. As the smaller they get, the more dangerous they can become. The smaller they get, they get deeper inside your respiratory system and can cause some more big damage. And of course, I'm not too big on ideas on how the respiratory system works, but you get the idea. And this is a big concern. If this volcano is erupting daily, these small amounts of ash could really start to hurt people if people aren't careful. All right, and so just to highlight the photos real quick, this photo up here was done by a work study in this area, working on this cristobalite study, and it shows the different ejecta patterns of a few of the major events. So this red being the Bunmai eruption, so this is how far out the Bunmai eruption hit. You have the blue right here is the Ni eruption, hitting over down here. And then the yellow is the Taisho, which goes all the way down here. And as you can see, the ejecta can go very far and hit these far cities. And so if another major eruption like any of those in the past, the Anai, the Bunmi, the Tempo Hyoji, if that one of those eruptions happen, this could be catastrophic to the entire area. And this picture down here shows Sakurajima, but I hope you can see how dense some of these cities look. Like this is right on the coast. You have people living on Sakurajima, the island. And over there, of course, there's the city of, I actually believe this is Kagoshima. But if this volcano erupts, then these people, if it's a major eruption, these people might die instantly. It's a very precarious thing. These citizens around this area prepare for the disaster every single day. I mean, this volcano is erupting at small amounts, but they're ready for the big guy. They live in fear every day of their lives, which is incredibly wild to me. All right, well, that's pretty much it. But I wanted to highlight again that Sakurajima erupts every single day. And I mean, here's some pictures of the eruptions that happened. This guy happened, 2 days ago? Literally 2 days ago, 1 day ago. This guy down here, happened in September. I mean, this volcano is erupting every single day. And then I thought one of the coolest things about this volcano, in January of 2019, NASA got this picture of Sakurajima erupting, and this thing was pumping off the lightning, which looks insanely cool, I might add. And yeah, that is about it. Thanks so much for watching.